my friend Vladimir Turovsky from Germany has a question or a solution. Volodya, what do you have? A question or a solution?
I have a hypothesis, but first a question.
Okay.
So should we begin now?
Yes.
Okay. This is a question for you and for Joel, for the wise ones, and it concerns the meaning of the word amazing from the end of the last session. What was so amazing in Jesus' answer? Because amazing is a reaction to something unexpected. So we have two ways of interpreting it. Either it was a fact that this sort of preacher from the woods gave this clever answer which amazed them, or it was the inhalt, the substance of the answer which amazed them. So do you have...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem that has bothered scholars. What is so amazing about this answer? I don't think that in the Markan portrayal, they should be surprised by now that Jesus gives a clever answer. So I don't think it's just that, this guy from rural places, son of a carpenter, knows how to answer a question. But I guess in the portrayal, they think that they're going to be able to catch him out and make him say something compromising, either about the government or about those who are against the government. And he evades that difficulty. So I guess that's what's amazing. It's the cleverness of his ability to not get in trouble. I guess that's what's meant to be portrayed, but it is something that bothers people who look at this passage, and bothered me. And I think I say something in the commentary about, well, they say the answer is, they're amazed by the answer, but what's so amazing about the answer? And I do think it's a good question, and I don't really have a better answer than that.
Okay, so now you have an answer, and do you have a solution to this answer?
No, I have an answer which is not an answer.
Okay, Volodya, and you?
Well, I have a hypothesis about, I think it can be both, that they are amazed both at the cleverness of his avoiding this trap and the kind of answer he's given. Joel, you told us last time that there are lots of possible and, many interpretations of Caesars to Caesar and gods to God. And Michael mentioned that lots of answers of Jesus' answers are like puzzles. So my hypothesis would be, and could you maybe comment on that, that he gave not a sort of answer the Old Testament gives, like do this precisely, don't do that precisely, but gives you a sort of way to think about it, and you should think about it yourself. What does it mean that which he says, and which has to do with a fundamental principle of free will, which is much more stressed in New Testament than in the Old Testament. Maybe could you comment on that?
Well, I guess the first thing that occurs to me is that free will versus determinism. That's a big problem, not only in the Old Testament but also in the New Testament, and especially this gospel has one of the most deterministic statements of all, and that's the parable theory in chapter 14. You don't understand because you're not supposed to understand, because God wants some people not to understand. Now, I don't think that's the only thing that the Jesus in Mark's gospel says about that, but it is the most deterministic. It has been called the most predestinarian statement in all of the gospels. So I guess I'm a little bit dubious about your solution. I think it would make a nice homily, but I don't take it as I don't see that as an exegesis of what's going on here. I have to frankly say.
Okay,
Thank you, Joel.
thank you.
To my mind, there's probably a simple explanation to what is so extraordinary in this saying, so extraordinary that people are amazed. The question is formulated as an either-or question, and it looks a nice trap, because if you say yes, you are to be immediately arrested. If you say no, then you go against the popular sensitivities, and so on and so on. So the guy is trapped. Whatever he says, he has problems, either with the people or with the authorities. But the guy deconstructs this trap and gives an answer that allows him to escape this trap. And like in any other case, when people seem to be trapped, but somehow they manage to turn things over in a completely different way. This is a really amazing thing. For example, some sayings of Greek philosophers, or like many other passages in the gospel narrative, where Jesus behaves himself or answers in an unexpected way. I think that the reason for amazement is clear even without recourse to such conceptions as free will and so on and so on.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. It seems to me that the difficult thing about the answer is that it raises another question. Namely, he says, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God." But then the question that raises is, what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God?
Exactly.
So
I don't know whether you have such an idiom in English, the US English. In Russia, we have a concept, idea, отвечает по-еврейски. This means answering in a Jewish way. People is asked, but instead of giving an answer, he responds to this question with another counter question. And this is a very nice example of отвечать по-еврейски. Do you have such a concept or such an image in American English?
No, I don't think it's not a phrase, but of course people have commented on, it's a Jewish habit to answer a question with another question. And Jesus does that directly sometimes in Mark. I note that in my commentary. But of course here, yes, he is sort of doing that, but he's asking this other question in an indirect and not in a direct way. But I think, I think the fact that his answer raises this other question does open the door to something like what Vladimir was saying. He at least, in the history of interpretation, he has left it open to people to debate where the lines are between what belongs to God and what belongs to the government. And people have been struggling with that for 2,000 years. And of course, in this case, as we said last time, it's especially complicated because the very coin that's used portrays, a divine Caesar. So that, the built into Roman religion at the time is at least the idea that the Caesar, that the emperor is himself a god. And so, those who want to say that Jesus is saying, don't give anything to the emperor, will point to that image and say that, there's an implied clash between the kind of idolatrous claims of the government and the true prophetic claims of Jesus. And I don't think that's necessarily right, but it's a possible interpretation.
Okay. Thank you, Volodya, for having raised this issue. And now we continue. I think
Thank you.
it's better to read the whole pericope in order to be able to discuss simultaneously lexical, grammatical, and exegetical issues. Larissa, you are our чтица, as usual. So verses 18 through 27.
Kai erchontai sadukaioi prosauton, votinas legusin, anastasin me einai, kai eperoton auton legontes. Didaskale Moises egrapsen yemin voti ean tinas adelfos apotane, kai katalipa gunaika, kai me afeteknon. Yina labe go adelfos autu ten gunaika, kai exanastese spermato adelfo autu. Hepta adelfoi esan kai poprotas eleben gunaika, kai apotneskon uk afeken sperma. Kai godeuteros eleben auten, kai apetanen me katelipon sperma, kai hotriton godautos. Kai gepta uk afekan sperma. Eskaton panton kai he june apetanen. Ente anastasei tinas auton estai june. Oigar gepta eschon autem junaikan. Efe autois goisus u diatuto planaste me eidotes tas grafas me deten dunemin tuteu. Вотангар экнекрон, Анастосин, Уте, Гамусин, Уте, Гамидзонтай, Аль Исин, Пос Ангелой, Энтой Суранойс. Дальше, да?
Да.
Периде тонне крон, готи эгейронтай, ук, аненкосе, анененте энто библio, Моисеус епитубату, пос эйпен ауто, готеос, легон эго готеос. Авраам, кай, готеос Исаак, кай, готеос Яков. Укостин теос некрон, алядзотон, полю планасте.
Thank you. Евхаристо. Ну, как и в других случаях, тот текст, который сейчас вот мы видим на наших экранах, это мой перевод более раннего меня, который больше, чем я сейчас тяготел бы к функциональному переводу. Вот срок. К нему подошли саддукеи. Они утверждают, что воскресения мертвых не будет, и стали говорить. Может быть, стали спрашивать, все-таки эксплицитно сказано. Вопрос, да? Кажется, важно сохранить вот это. И что здесь был вопрос. Согласны?
Да.
Что здесь я, как у нас, видите, часто бывает, в последнее время немножко приближаю текст к оригиналу. Учитель, Моисей предписал нам. Но здесь я греческую косвенную речь перевожу в прямую, но мне кажется, что для русского уха это будет немножко естественнее. Но если вы скажете, что стоит здесь тоже сохранить греческий косвенный, греческую косвенный вопрос, то можно будет задуматься. Но я пока что считаю то, что есть, то есть прямая речь. Если у кого-нибудь умрет брат и оставит после себя вдову, я думаю, что здесь бюнайка, естественно, прийти как вдову, чем как жену, а детей не оставит, то брат усопшего должен жениться на его вдове. Вот, собственно, здесь я греческий конъюнктив «гинолабе» перевожу в прямую речь, да, должен жениться. Мне кажется, так немножко проще понять это без того непростой сложный текст. Чтобы продолжить его род. Вот здесь может быть на самом деле буквальный перевод в чем-то точнее схватывает, передает как-то и образность, и метафорику еврейского текста. Что скажете? У нас вот сейчас я выведу это дело в нашей любимой программе Bible Works. Кажется, большинство переводов на разные языки мира это все дело пытаются как-то сохранить еврейскую метафорику здесь. Видите, надальный восстановить семя брату своему. King James Version, once again, raise up seed unto his brother. recent translations like New American Bible or New International Version, or New Jerusalem Bible, and New Revised Standard Version speaks about children.
Yeah, I don't like those translations. I mean, you lose something if in English, I think, if you don't say seed. And I don't think that it's I think people will understand it if you say seed. So, why go for a sort of paraphrase?
Of course, we have a lot of passages where the Hebrew zera or Greek sperma definitely refers to descendants, and it would be an over translation to read the meaning seed into it.
It's an over translation, you're saying?
There are a lot of places where Hebrew zera or Greek sperma, especially in the Septuagint, just means offsprings. And it would be an over translation to read seed into these contexts. But as concerns this particular context, I still believe it is some important imagery that would be lost if we depart from literal translation.
Yeah, because I mean, behind this whole thing is I think the image of the sperm, of the father, and the life potency of the clan is not lost. That's what's behind the law. So and besides, when like this occurs in Pauline letters too, the sperma, like sperma Abraham, and there, and Paul does this whole thing there with its, it says sperma, one seed, so he's playing with this image.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So does rod. Rod is connected to rodina, right? Are they etymologically related? Those words in
Роды, родина и родить, yes, definitely. They're related.
Right. Anyway, I don't like, so many of these English translations have become so paraphrastic that I just think you lose a lot.
Yes.
And and sometimes it's very political. They're trying to escape from difficulties that have been raised by feminists and so on, which are legitimate difficulties, but I don't think that the translation is the place to solve those problems.
Exactly. Yes, I just put on our virtual blackboard Genesis 15:13, where I think reading seed into this passage, like King James Version does, would be, I think, an over translation. Here, when we speak about Abraham's descendants, that will be for several hundred years working for foreigners. I think here translation like offsprings, descendants is quite legitimate. But here in our place, there's a definite play with that image, and differently from what I did when I first made this translation, I would probably suggest that we revert to more literal way. More.
May I have a question?
Okay.
I also think about is there any connection, intended connection here between exanastase and anastasis in verse 18? I think many English translations try to save this connection, translating exanastase with raise up. To make clear this connection with resurrection.
I would think that a Greek reader would be making that connection.
Yeah, because if they do not believe in true resurrection, they probably substitute this true resurrection with this procedure of resurrecting offsprings of died men.
Yeah, and I mean, I think of this a lot in Mark. Like even when Jesus, different verb when Jesus raises up, the Tabitha, in chapter 5. There I think agero is used, and of course both agero and anastasis and related verbs, anastime, are that's resurrectional vocabulary. So I would think that as the reader is going through this and sees Jesus raising people up, and then Jesus himself raised up at the end, that there's that I think, probably the idea would occur that it's that same, how is he doing this? This is the same power that will raise him from the dead. It's the same divine power already manifesting itself in these miraculous healings.
It's interesting that the very first occurrence of this collocation in the Greek Bible, Genesis 4:25, deals with a very similar question. Do you now see my window with Bible Works?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's about the first human pair. It's eponymos ento onoma autou set legusa exanestesen germoi hotos sperma heteron. The same collocation and the same situation. There's a danger of having no descendants. The danger of the life of a clan being terminated. But then God,
well, and of course, and of course in patristic exegesis, Abel becomes a symbol of Christ.
Yes, exactly. What is especially interesting with regard to the Septuagint of Genesis 4:25 is that we do not have any hint in the Hebrew text that would point into that direction. Ki shatli Elohim zera. Sheet does not have anything that would point into the way for resurrection or establishing. It's interesting that probably some idea, some intellectual movement into this direction has already occurred in the milieu of Greek-speaking Jews before the translation of the first book of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. It's not. It's not a normal equivalent to Hebrew sheet.
Which isn't a very common verb, is it?
Yes.
Shot.
Yes, we can just check through our database. It will take us no more than half a minute to look at how this is translated. Of course, the most common translation is titemi, but also epiballo, tasso, didomi, ephistemi, kathistemi, synepititemi, even metanoeo, apostrepho, exenistemi is just once
Yeah.
for this very widespread root. Just once and only in this particular passage.
Yeah, I didn't
But
remember that
it's probably derived from other places where the same situation is described, like in Genesis 38, 8.
Genesis 38:8. Wait
Yeah.
a second.
Yeah. And there,
Genesis
same
38.
the
38:8, Marka, да?
38:8 Genesis, and the same procedure is called in Hebrew Hekim Zera, and so in Greek it's anistemi, sperma.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
But this raises another question, really interesting, probably deserving a special article. We did not have this meaning of anistemi before the passage you mentioned. Yes. A very widespread verb occurs very often. But this meaning seems to occur first with the Genesis Genesis 38. But since we think it would be logical to presume that the translation started with the beginning of Genesis and later moved towards the end. We cannot take as a hypothesis a direct influence for translation of Genesis 38 on the translation of Genesis 4. So probably this was some sort of collocation, some sort of probably law expression, which may be coined after the pattern that we have in Genesis 38 and parallel passages, but was probably coined before this chapter, as the chapter was translated into Greek.
Well, you're the Septuagint expert, so the two of you. I mean, how would you know one way or the other which comes first?
Yeah, it's it's true that the translator of Genesis unifies all different verbs describing this this situation, this procedure. In Genesis 19, I think this word occurs the third time in the Septuagint, 1932, and again in Hebrew the verb is different, but in Greek the same. And yeah, for me the most interesting thing is whether they actually associate this raising of the seed with some sort of resurrection, or bringing back to life. Can we say this from this usage or not? I think it's the most interesting question here. Or it's just coincidence.
I mean, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because
yeah.
I mean, life itself is a miracle, and then the resurrection of the dead is a further extension of that miracle, or it's bringing it to a new level. But it's the same sort of thing, where you had nothing, all of a sudden you have something, you have a living being. First one sort of life, and then maybe another sort of life. I would think that would be a logical sort of progression of theological thought that might make its way into this sort of generalizing practice of using verbs with anistemi. That's interesting. Has somebody written about that?
I don't know yet. Yeah, but we can check.
But this is interesting, exactly because if this case of translating Hebrew shit with anistemi, if it occurred after Genesis 38, then one could have postulated the direct influence of the earlier translation on the later translation. But in this case, what occurs, at least to my mind, is that the Hebrew mentality, as it is penetrated in the Hebrew Bible, contributed to the idea of replacing the seed of the dead brother as a kind of resurrection. Then this idea found its way in the milieu of Greek-speaking Jews before the translation, and contributed to and made itself felt in the translation of the very first chapter.
But it's not really true, because in the first instance in Hebrew a common expression is changed because of the etymological wordplay with the name Seth, Shet there, and so it's just purposely changed. But in Genesis 19:32, I think the form of the verb chaya is used. I think it should be hifid of chaya there, and it's the same to make alive. So yeah, it's not really so different.
Okay.
I would.
In any case, returning back to our dialogue. And back to our dialogue. What can we do with our text, with our translation? It seems that in the light of our discussions, we more or less agreed that the idea of seed, the association with seed, should be left here in the translation. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so, because, you know, I think what the passage goes on to do is sort of reject kind of materialistic interpretations of what the next life is like, you know, and so, you know, it sort of enters into a debate that was probably already going on amongst Jews, and that you can see in rabbinic traditions about, you know, is the next life going to be like this life or different? You know, how similar and or how different? You know, will people marry? Will they have sex? Um, or will they just be totally spiritual? And it seems to me that in this passage, Jesus is going with the spiritual
Yes.
connection.
So making the Sadducees' argument less metaphorical, more physiological, contributes to making more evident the inner logic of this passage.
Well, yeah, of course, yeah, they think that the whole idea is crazy, so they're trying to ridicule it by portraying it in a materialistic way. And
Okay.
Jesus rejects the interpretation that they propose that isn't their own interpretation. You know, they're trying to show that I think, you know, that the Pharisaic position of that, you know, about the resurrection of the dead is illogical, and they're wanting Jesus to take a stand on it.
Друзья, видите нашу греко-русскую билингву? Кто за ту правку, которую мы сейчас в нее внесли?
Ну, я, честно говоря, не поняла, зачем семя. Мне кажется, потомство ничем не хуже здесь. Мне кажется, по-русски. В смысле, мне хочется обязательно сделать восстановить, чтобы хотя бы какую-то, ну, в смысле, понятно, что по-русски мы не можем сделать прямо обыграть с воскресением, но восстановить, по крайней мере, сохранит какую-то связку. Вот, а семя, я не вижу обязательной необходимости переводить семя, а не потомство.
Не знаю, может быть, мы к этому можем еще вернуться, когда дальше дойдем как раз уже до обсуждения ответа. Пока оставим это. Да, Лариса?
В славянском переводе там как раз воскресит семя брату своему, и это как сказать, это прекрасно рифмуется с 23 стихом. В воскресенье уба егда воскреснут, которому их будет жена.
Ну, да, это, конечно, мысль, но не знаю, мне кажется, что, может быть, это уже слишком, все-таки немножко разные слова, и мне кажется, они правильно поймали эту идею, но
Нет, я это не предлагаю, мне показалось интересно, чтобы это
да-да-да, это
Да-да-да.
видно, что они
Это очень красиво.
хотели
У меня тоже вот сейчас такая идея тоже мелькнула, но все-таки это было бы как раз именно, что называется over translation.
не знаю, восставят, может быть, если уж
Восставит, да, Маша, я как раз тоже думал, восставит. Собственно, воскреснет, в славянском же используется как раз «да воскреснет Бог», это уже мы переосмысляем как воскресение Спасителя, но, очевидно, имеется в виду, что пусть встанет. Но восставит семя.
да, мне
Но это
кажется, если уж мы оставляем семя, то, может, восставят.
Но, опять-таки, если речь идет о филологическом переводе, тогда, конечно, и семя надо оставлять. А если good news, тогда и потомство, а это
Нет,
уже оставить на
нет, но
разнодумье.
в русском языке есть слово «семя», в русском языке есть глагол «восстановить», в русском языке нет глагола «восставить» в этом значении, или в каком бы то ни было значении.
Воздвигнет, может быть, если уж надо вот эту идею, что он восстает из мертвых.
Воздвигнет другой немножко, нет?
Ну, другой, да, ну что-нибудь, наверное, какой-то каузатив, наверное, вставать можно придумать. Вот. Ну, восстановить семя, Михаил Георгиевич, как-то странно звучит, восстановить семя.
Но я думаю, что это, может быть, звучит столь же странно, как для нормального грека звучало бы «эксонистас и сперма».
Да, ну вот Ира тоже предлагает воскресить семя. Ну,
Кто предлагает Ира?
в чате она тоже голосует за воскресить. Ну, в
Может,
Лидоскопе самый первый контекст на эксонистами — это как раз Тунтанонтас из Софокла.
а вернуть это слишком далеко уже уходит, да? Вернуть семя брата.
Вернуть это что-то, что первоначально забрал.
Михаил Георгиевич, но слово «восставить», оно существует в русском языке, оно, конечно, устаревшее, вот, и
Можно ли какой-нибудь пример?
В комментариях, Михаил Георгиевич, сейчас просто погуглил, в комментариях как раз-таки к аналогичным стихам вот «восставит семя», да, встречается. Просто
нет,
устаревший. Я
современный
могу...
почти исключительно геометрический, восставить перпендикуляр, вот,
Да, как у Бродского, да.
вот, но, например, еще удаля вполне в наших значениях необходимых, как восстановить.
Ну, давайте, может, пока так вот остановим. Но, по крайней мере, правильно я понимаю, что все-таки прежний наш перевод кажется все-таки участникам нашего нано-семинара все-таки слишком гудньюсовским. Нет? Ну, давайте тогда в качестве временной какой-то меры Михаил делал желтым цветом. Поставим то, что здесь у нас уже стоит. И двинемся дальше. Дальше у нас, мне кажется, на протяжении какого-то времени ни с переводом, ни с экзегезой проблем нету. Было 7 братьев. Старший женился. Умер, детей не оставил. Второй брат взял ее. Ну, мне кажется, вполне легитимно не перегружать мозги читателя этим странным личным исследованием. Здесь взял его вдову себе в жены, детей не оставил. Из того, что старший взял себе жену, может так?
Может,
Это,
взял
да?
её в жены?
Нет, да, взял себе, он по-русски взял себе жену. Давайте. Да, это вот так вот получается. Ближе к оригиналу, конечно. Так, нормально?
Мгм. А вы в первом случае переводите сперма как семя, а дальше как дети, потому что
Ну да.
там как бы цитата, а здесь уже нет? Или почему?
Ну потому что старший взял себе жену, умер, спермы не оставил, это как-то будет выглядеть очень... Это будет выглядеть намного более физиологично, я думаю, чем это имели в виду саддукеи, и намного больше перекликаться с технологиями 21 века, чем с реалиями рубежа R. Ну, как семьи не оставил. Здесь действительно у нас получается, что вот в этой игре мы где-то должны произвести деметафоризацию. Вот, но немножко обидно с первым стихом. Здесь, может быть, не так обидно. Или вы считаете, что здесь тогда мы разрываем связь между спермой в первой строчке и спермой в остальных строчках?
Нет, я просто спросила. Да нет, нормально, можно и так сделать.
Хорошо.
I have a question about translation.
Окей.
In verse 20, you're translating hoprotos as starshi.
Да.
So that means like the oldest brother. I mean,
Okay. Agreed. Theoretically, the first among the brothers who married was not necessarily the elder. Again.
yeah, or it may even be the first one to die, so
Yes.
it's just like there's 7 brothers and first one of them takes a wife and then he dies. So yeah, okay.
Yes. Thank you, Joe. It's really important. И с третьим было то же самое. Никто из 7 так и не оставил потомства. Последний из всех умерла эта женщина. Так кому же она будет женой после воскресения, когда все не воскреснут? Ведь все 7 были ее мужьями. Мне кажется, нормально там, где мы здесь сейчас даже что-то и чуть-чуть не совсем слово за слово приводит греческий текст, но это все вполне легитимные переводы. Иисус ответил им: запутались вы, ланасты, потому что ни Писания не знаете, ни силы Божьей. после воскресения из мертвых люди уже не женятся и не выходят замуж, но подобно ангелам на небесах. Это первый ответ, который касается конкретно аргумента. This is his first rebuttal, which concerns the arguments that the Sadducees had against the idea of resurrection. And then, not directly linked with the preceding text, we have not the rebuttal of their counter-argument against the idea of resurrection, but an argument for resurrection. А что мертвые воскресли, так неужели вы не читали книги Моисея, где говорится про куст горящий? Слово горящий я добавил. Понятно, что ипи тубату – это название перекопы. Напросто. Да? Ипи тубату. Как Бог обратился к Моисею со словами: «Я Бог Авраама, Бог Исаака и Бог Иакова». А ведь он Бог не мертвых, но живых. Так что вы совсем запутались. Да, так я перевожу греческое планасты. Окей. Есть какие-нибудь замечания? Any suggestions or comments on the two arguments posed by Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, the second is a scriptural argument. The first is just kind of a theological assertion about the nature of the life to come. And one thing that's interesting is, you know, he says that there won't be marrying in the next life. Everybody will be like the angels. But of course, there were different concepts of the angels, and, you know, from some Old Testament texts and their developments in intertestamental literature, you would think, well, the angels, you know, are not always so celibate, actually. Like in Genesis 6 and the developments of that in traditions like Jubilees and First Enoch. So it's interesting that the angels are a counter argument, or the angels, these celibate angels, are an image of what life is going to be like in the next age. But again, you know, not all angels were so celibate.
Yes, that's
And of
exactly
course-
what you know from the beginning of Genesis 6.
Yeah. And of course, you know, that Genesis 6 became a very important text in some circles, especially Qumran and related circles, and people were just speculating about it all over the place. And it sort of becomes an alternate explanation for the origin of sin. It results from this intermarriage of angels with human beings.
So the potential audience of these verses, to your mind, did they know Genesis 6 and its interpretation within circles like Enoch and so on?
Yeah, well, of course, that's the difficulty, you know, I face. I wrote a whole book on Mark's use of the Old Testament for his Christology, and that's the difficulty I always faced. You know, how much do they know of A, the Old Testament, and B, of, you know, traditions of interpretation of the Old Testament? And I guess you could probably safely say that some members of the audience knew more than others of the Old Testament background and its developments. But I think it's impossible to say. I do think even like by the time you get to the Passion narrative, there's some parts that are very difficult to understand if you don't have the Old Testament background in mind. So and one would think that Mark isn't just spinning these things out of his own knowledge of the Old Testament and not thinking that anybody will pick it up. But yeah, it's very difficult to say. But that was a problem that always bothered me when I was writing about use of the Old Testament in Mark.
Okay, and what can we say about the scriptural argument that you have in verse 26?
Well, I think it's very interesting because, it's another case of, taking this scriptural formula, which is used, many times, just to emphasize like the continuity. It's the same God who was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is now also like delivering his people from Egypt, right? But Jesus interprets it in a kind of forced way to say that it's implying that those guys are not dead, but they are living, because he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, I don't think that that's what it meant in its original context, but that Old Testament passage is being read through what it's trying to prove. It's kind of this backwards theological reinterpretation that takes the theological point as the presupposition and then rereads the Old Testament passage in line with that presupposition. And I don't think that this, and in general, for a New Testament exegesis, I don't think that it would, I think it's meant for insiders. It's meant for those who already, say, believe in the resurrection of the dead. It's not directly polemical. It's not going to convince those who have the opposite presupposition. Because, what the Sadducees here should say is that, well, that's not what that passage is saying. It's just saying that the same God who was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is now the same God who is going to deliver Moses and the people from Egypt.
Окей. Еще какие-нибудь замечания у нас по экзегезе или по русскому переводу этого кусочка? Окей.
Можно
Ну,
я спрошу?
Конечно.
Я вас хотела спросить, воскресенья не будет или его нет? Или это одно и то же?
Хороший вопрос. По-гречески у нас, конечно же, Войтнес легусин анастасин меэйной, что наиболее естественным образом читается просто, что его нет, не бывает. То, что я перевел «не будет», это уже, конечно, отчасти под влиянием нашего понимания тех споров, которые были в иудаизме рубежа веков между разными религиозными течениями. А как бы предложили перевести?
I think I agree with what I think Maria said. That the question is just of the existence of the next life, right? So that's what me'enai means.
Угу.
Is there such a thing as the life to come?
Окей. Но как нам это сказать по-русски? How can we say this in Russian?
Looks like Irina had a suggestion.
Ирина, вы луки? Не бывает. Но не бывает, мне кажется, лучше, чем нет. Да?
Я бы сказал нет.
Что нет. Нет или не бывает. Может быть, здесь все-таки действительно не будет, равно как и нет, говорит про одноразовое событие. То самое, о котором у нас, собственно говоря, здесь действующие лица и спорят. И как и спорили авторитеты, религиозные авторитеты этого времени. Вот не бывает, это действительно немножко про другое, про то, что такого у нас не случается. Давайте. Ну, а может быть, вот так сделаем? Видна наша диглотта? Вот так? Потому что лучше такой порядок слов.
Да.
Well, you and Masha persuaded me to change this from future будет to more general нет. Окей. Да, наверное, так правильнее. То есть это еще один, наверное, такой пример того, что все-таки какие-то нюансы мы теряем, если входим в изначального текста. Спасибо. Еще по этому месту, по этому отрывку какие-то замечания, идеи, предложения?
На минуту, если вернуться к этому желтому тексту, восстановить семя своего брата, может быть, сказать возродить семя своего брата. Восстановить все-таки странно.
Было быть лучше, да. Спасибо, Володь. Давайте по традиции нашего мини-семинара произведем, когда речь идет про русские какие-то варианты голосования. Кто за прозвучавший здесь предложение Владимира, а именно, если у кого-нибудь умрет брат и оставить после себя вдову, а детей не оставит, то брат усопшего должен жениться на его вдове, чтобы возродить семя брата своего. Вот. Что за такую формулировку по отношению к тем лексическим выборам, что мы делали до этого? Поднимите руки.
I'd like to mention a couple of other things that I say in my commentary, just
Okay.
keeping in mind this is a debate with the Sadducees. First of all, it's interesting, the passage that Jesus uses to prove the resurrection from the dead isn't such a clear proof, as I was saying before. There's other passages that would, like from Daniel, he talks about resurrection clearly at the end of the book. I guess there's some debate about whether the Sadducees accepted as canonical anything other than the Pentateuch. So, and if they don't, then it would make sense that the passage that he cites is from the Pentateuch, from the burning bush thing. But the other thing that's interesting is you think about what Jesus says here about he is not a God of the dead, but of the living. That could very well be a Sadducean slogan. In other words, they didn't believe in a life after death. And so it's possible that he is not a God of the dead, but of the living, is something that they would have said that Jesus is then taking up and using against them in this passage.
It's a very interesting idea. The problem is that it's not so easy either to prove or to disprove it.
Yeah, it's a suggestion. Yeah. I see from my commentary that I got this idea from one of my graduate students. And then, but I don't know, I think it would make sense it would make sense that was a Sadducean slogan. So I admit that it's kind of speculative, but I also think it's cool.
Yes, Paul often does this. In some cases, Paul is credited with quoting what his adversaries said or believed, their slogans. So probably he will have something like this, but it's more difficult to prove than in the case of Paul.
Yeah. But I do think the other point is also interesting. I mean, why does he choose this passage? It's not, he could have chosen a much more obvious passage that speaks much more clearly about resurrection.
Within the Pentateuch?
Huh?
Within the Pentateuch?
Yeah.
You said that.
Okay.
You said that probably the discussion was to be limited with argumentation from the Pentateuch, and probably this was not connected only with the Sadducees' view of the Scripture. It may well be that at that time, as well as in later Judaism as well, the authority of the Pentateuch was much more important than the authority of any other text.
Well, I can see that. And of course, the burning bush passage it's an important passage that was much commented on. So if you can prove the resurrection of the dead from the burning bush, then that's good.
In the Pentateuch, I do not remember any differently from Daniel or even Ezekiel, if we understand literally his picture of resurrection. We can even read the idea of resurrection into some of other prophetic writings, but I do not remember anything in the Pentateuch that would be adduced as an argument for the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Well,
argument
yeah.
from the burning bush was as good or as bad as any other place from the Pentateuch.
Well, you don't think Ezekiel, whatever that is, Ezekiel 37 is a better passage to use about the bones coming together and that
Yes, but this is still outside of the Pentateuch.
outside of the Pentateuch. Okay, yeah. But it's interesting when you think of the passages that do outside of the Pentateuch do talk about resurrection. You know, some of them are more physical and some of them more, quote, spiritual, right? Like the Ezekiel passage has bone coming together with bone, you know, so
Yes.
it's very physical. Whereas the Daniel is, you know, it's more like astral immortality, or, you know, it's not exactly that, but it's, you know, the righteous are being compared to stars shining. So there's this, you know, there's a repertoire within the Old Testament of ways to talk about life to come, and some of them are more materialistic and some of them are less materialistic. And again, you know, the rabbis have debates about the age to come and how physical or otherwise it'll be. And, you know, they have debates about, like, you know, if you lose a limb in this life, will you still have that limb lost in the next life? So, you know, these were questions that were agitating people. And, you know, Jesus is entering into a debate not only about, you know, whether or not there is a life after death, but if so, what sort of life will it be?
Yes. Exactly the same that we have with the idea of Messiah. The question is not only whether he is Messiah or not, but what kind of Messiah is being spoken
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. You know, that people, you know, may have embraced a general concept, but then defined it in different ways.
I have a question about this passage. Can we probably or maybe deduce something from the end of the passage where Jesus says, "You are confused, you are mixed up"? Could be argument from the well about the whole content from this one, back argument, so to speak.
Yeah, this verb planao, you know, it's used, I think, several times in the New Testament, including in chapter 13 of Mark, for a kind of eschatological deception, right? And you notice, you know, it's a middle or passive form, and I tend to take these as more passive. You know, you have been deceived. in line with, this just general idea of apocalyptic delusion that falls on people in the last time, which I think is pretty clear in chapter 13. Jesus both warns his disciples that they should not be deceived, using the same verb, but he also speaks of those who will come in my name and will deceive many in the middle of the chapter. So I think it is an important verb, which I would view in that sort of eschatological context, So, I mean, he's not letting them off the hook. He's saying that they are deceived, and I think the implication is somebody has deceived them, in line with the general eschatological and demonological framework of the whole gospel.
But then запутались is not the best translation.
Окей. А как мы скажем best translation? Обманываетесь?
No idea.
Заблуждаетесь?
So do you use that same translation in like the beginning of chapter 13? 13:1 or 2, I think the same verb occurs.
You mean Mark 13?
Yeah, Mark 13, yeah. Isn't that?
13, 5 and 6.
Yeah,
Mark
yeah,
13.
yeah, it does, but it occurs earlier than that. Doesn't he say, oh, maybe you're right. Better get my concordance, my old-fashioned concordance.
We have a more contemporary concordance, namely
We have a
our,
more up-to-date concordance, a more
yes,
high-tech.
That's our high-tech concordance. You see, John,
No.
13.5, 13.6.
13, no, yeah, you're right. 13:5 and 6. Okay. It also, yeah, occurs in 12:24 and 12:27. Okay, so those are the only usages. Okay, but 13:5 and 6, yeah, is speaking about somebody who's going to come. Well, about the danger that somebody would
Yes.
deceive the disciples.
I used
And then
here
13:6 is
I used here the verb обмануть, to deceive.
Okay.
Может быть, и здесь тоже, так сказать, обманываетесь. Но не знаю.
And you can't use that in the Sadducee passage?
Почему-то мне кажется, что здесь вот у нас обманываться, обманывать, English to deceive, to be deceived, that's more about some evil person who is producing the deceit. But Do you think that this passage that we are talking about today implies that there is someone, for example, some evil spirit who deceives the Sadducees in passive? This would bring this closer to the passages in chapter 13 that you mentioned, but probably this is more medium than passive. Yeah.
Well,
It was
I guess I
actively.
think the demonological framework is so general in Mark that I tend to see it everywhere. So I wouldn't exclude it from 1227.
But probably more in commentaries as a possible interpretation, a possible overtone,
Mhm.
not as the main translation.
I mean,
Русскоязычный.
I guess I'm also thinking there's other ways that Jesus could have said you're wrong, than using this verb, which I think, does imply that somebody is, we say in English, pulling the wool over your eyes. Somebody is darkening your vision.
Есть ли какие-то у русскоязычных наших участников предложения по поводу лексического выбора? Если не запутались, то что?
This is a funny comparison, but I'm rewatching the movies of the Lord of the Rings, the Tolkien thing. And I mean, when something goes wrong there, and lots of things go wrong, they don't always say that this is the influence of the Dark Lord Sauron, but he must be behind it, because he's the source of all the evil. And I think that work of literature has a thoroughgoing demonological explanation for evil, and I think Mark is similar. So that even when it's not specifically invoked, one can assume it's there.
Okay, let's mark this translation with yellow color so that we can think it over later. I think our today's meeting is almost at the end. Next week is the Holy Weekend. Next Thursday is the eve of the Good Friday. So I think it is probably we are to miss our next Thursday because of our Orthodox calendar. By the way, this year
Our calendar is the same.
Our calendars coincide. So you will also have the same calendar and the same days devoted to remembering of the Passion.
Right.
Okay. It might have been good for us if our seminar coincided with our liturgical calendar in such a way that we look at the Passion narrative during this Holy Week. With the tempo that we follow, this may be the case during next year.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, we'll still be looking at it next year. So,
Okay. In any case, I think we may preliminarily congratulate ourselves and each other with these holidays and with the approaching Easter. And then we will meet on the Easter week in 2 weeks' time.
okay. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. See you.